Thanks to the conference organizers. It's lovely being here, having a great time. Okay, so Underground Astronomy, publishing Galileo Siderius Nuncius. The general story is well known. In the summer of 1609, Galileo Galilei, professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, heard about a new invention that made far-away objects appear closer. Phew. Okay, good. All right, we got a telescope there. Yeah. He set to work to make his own spyglass, an object that initially fluctuated between a military instrument, a deceptive toy, and an optical device, and presented it as a gift to the Venetian Doge. Just look at the top half of this letter to start with, not the bottom half. And then he turned it to the skies. That's the bottom half. There, in the space of a few weeks in December 1609 and January 1610, he made several startling discoveries. Lunar mountains. There's his calculations for the height of a lunar mountain. New stars. And most spectacularly, in probably the most famous piece of paper from the 17th century, 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. So this is the first week of observations of the little, what become during this process of observation, satellites and not fixed stars. His observations swiftly became a small masterpiece called the Siderius Nuncius, or Starry Messenger. The Siderius Nuncius is hardly an understudied book. Its happy combination of powerful rhetoric, innovative images, and novel cosmology gave it instant impact, and it's a book that still offers an exciting entry point to our own narratives of scientific revolution. It seems to offer a paradigmatic example of objective observations, the view from nowhere, the superhuman eye transported beyond geopolitical borders. Its own observations are physically fixed in Padua, but this does not matter to its arguments. They are potentially universally replicable. We don't need to carry on constructing big observatories in Uraniborg, as Tycho Brahe had done. We can just buy a telescope and see the stars from anywhere. Its stellar visions are boundless. Sorry, there's the lunar illustrations. Its stellar visions are boundless, printed initially on oversized sheets, with many stars now lost to the book trimmer's knife and binder's art. So here we have the same page in 2 different copies, just to illustrate what the text originally looked like when it came off out of the print shop. And then over the years, these things have been trimmed down and down and down with the loss of lots of stars. Stars end up in the gutters of these books a lot. Precisely because of its apparent immediacy, transparency, and ability to provide readers with a sense of virtual witnessing, to jump across time and space, the Siderius Nuncius's own social and material process of production and reception have been curiously invisible. So I'd like us to think about how a self-contained classic might be encouraged with the right kind of bibliographical questions into revealing its subtexts, contexts, and machinations. To start with a basic unasked question, bizarrely unasked, who printed the Siderius Nuncius? Well, that's a no-brainer, right? It says it right there. The answer seems self-evident. Tommaso Bali Oni, a young and minor printer who went on to found a multi-generational dynasty. But according to the dully reliable Venetian guild registers for printers, in 1610, Bali Oni was not registered to print or publish under his own name, and he'd only received that right in 1615. So this book is actually an illegal imprint at a very minor infraction level. Venetian books tend not to distinguish, as English books of the same period do, between a printer and a publisher. So you generally only get one name there, and it's unclear whether you're looking at a printer's name or a publisher's name, and those are 2 distinct activities. To understand where the book came from and why, we have to examine it not just as a text, but as a material object, looking for places where intention stops but meaning continues, almost literally in the margins. When we read the clues of the unintended alongside various other sources, the book in fact becomes a much stranger object. There are several tools available to understand how a book is materially related to other books. For incunabula, books printed before 1500, analysis of typeface offers a fairly reliable, though fraught, test for identifying printers and presses. By the 17th century, Italian typeface has become too standardized to be of much help. But ornamental woodcuts still vary enough and disintegrate physically quickly enough to act as markers indicating reuse of stock, presses, and personnel. The Sidereus contains 4 such woodcuts, or wood blocks. So one is there on the title page, and 3 others are in the preliminary material of the book and the start of the text proper. So I'm interested in these things that mean nothing. This woodcut here, which is repeated there, it's the same woodcut used in another gathering. Here we're in gathering A, and there we are in B. And then these ornamental letters, big P, little m, you can see they come from different alphabets, they have different styles. They mean absolutely nothing, and that's why they're interesting to a historian. So theoretically, with enough trained monkeys, one might find them occurring in earlier works and be able to construct their genealogy. When historians lack databasing simians, we rely on hunches, serendipity, and libraries. After about 250 request slips, I found all 4 of these wooden elements in earlier printed books, and they all, luckily for me, pointed to a single press, that of Girolamo and Niccolo Pollo. So here's one example, the earliest I found, from the year 1600, Il Rosario della Madonna. And if we look inside the text, we see here this P with a puto having a good time riding a dolphin with its, and if we compare the P from the Rosario della Madonna, I apologize for the low resolution there, you can see there's a little break on the, a bit of wood has chipped off the wood block, which was already the case in 1600. So we know we're looking not at one of a series of replicated wood blocks, but precisely the same piece of wood used in these 2 books, 10 years apart. And we can do this kind of analysis with each of these elements.
What were typically the numbers of these editions in this period?
Average book edition, we generally say 500 to 1,000. Galileo claims he printed a book in 60 copies. Some people have claimed editions of up to 3,000 or 4,000. So between 50 and 3,000, but mean about 750. For the Siderius Nuncius, it's 550, Galileo says. The Pollo brothers also used the headpiece elsewhere the year before the, year before the Siderius. So in 1609, Niccolo Pollo printed a book with that same headpiece that we see in the Siderius Nuncius, and there are lots of different ways of coming across the same conclusion. Here we have a book printed by Tommaso Bali Oni in 1610, and then this is the colophon, the final page of the book. It says in Venice, 1610, on the Pollo press. So we know who printed the Siderius Nuncius for the first time, or at least which press it was printed on, the Pollo press. The story, fortunately, does not end here. Here's why the question about presses, printers, and publishers is worth asking. So if Tommaso Bali Oni only received his guild membership to print and publish in 1615, what's his illegally... why is his name featuring illegally on a book in 1610? Various independent archival sources tell us that Bali Oni was the assistant to a licensed bookman called Roberto Meietti. The 2 men started working together in the 1590s, smuggling prohibited material across Alpine passes from the Frankfurt Book Fair in semi-complicity with top Venetian politicians. They're kind of official lawbreakers. Regularly harassed by inquisitors and their network of informants and spies, their barrels of books were sometimes confiscated, but they actually enjoyed enough protection to publish lists of the banned titles they had on offer in Venice. As early as 1588, when Maeti first set up shop in Venice, the Venetian inquisitors questioned him to find out why he was trying to shift large quantities of books to Padua and selling banned authors such as Rabelais and works by Neoplatonists and Hermeticists. Maeti also used the standard technique of substituting false title pages on prohibited books in order to dupe inspectors. And in 1594, he was even found to be distributing banned books in Rome. A repeat offender, in 1599, Maeti was threatened with a fine for the importation of banned books from Germany. Exploiting this epistemological fractures along the Dolomite borders provided a risky living for these and other bookmen. A few years before the publication of Galileo's Siderius Nuncius, in the year 1606, the never very fragrant relationship between Venetian gerontocrats, inquisitors, and bookmen turned to vinegar. A politically manufactured crisis resulted in Pope Paul V's placing Venice under interdict. It was generally assumed that war was imminent. This was generally good news for printers. Over the next 8 months, over 300 pamphlets and political treatises were printed, circulating alongside countless manuscript tracts. Pseudonyms proliferated, scarcely hiding the names and reputations of such hardened polemicists as Cardinal Bellarmine, the Jesuit priest Antonio Posavino, and the Venetian Servite Paolo Sarpi. False imprints were extremely commonplace. Maeti worked as the official smuggler of banned books for the Republic. In October 1606, a disguised Maeti factor, perhaps Tommaso Bali Oni himself, managed to slip through the Archbishop of Trent's roadblocks, but his books were seized, and we have an inventory of them. These were several thousand Italian and Latin books that Maeti had arranged to have printed over the Alps, as well as a few titles in support of Venice, printed in France, Germany, and Switzerland. These texts ricocheted within the Italian peninsula, but also made it across the Alps, where the ideological weapons mustered by the Venetians for their self-defense against Rome were swiftly hybridized, domesticated, and flung back into the political fray. Now, the printer chosen in 1606 by the Venetians for most of their official pronouncements was Bali Oni's boss, Roberto Maeti. Paolo Sarpi's Apologia, Appresso Roberto Maeti, 1606, the same author's Considerazione, the same author's Trattato, Mecanzio's Confermazione, Marsilio's Difesa. These are the most important books from the Venetian side in this political conflict, and they're all printed by Maeti in the year 1606. Rome responded not only with its own wave of publications, but also by unleashing its spiritual powers. In the year 1607, Maeti was excommunicated. He was the only interdict printer to suffer such punishment. Any publisher or bookseller dealing in Maeti books was subject to excommunication too. All business dealings with Maeti were prohibited. Maeti's books were burnt in Rome. No Catholic was supposed to read any book ever printed by Maeti. So what did Galileo do? In 1607, embroiled in a minor academic dispute, if that's not to risk tautology, with a plagiarizing student, he drafted a defense, his first printed book under his own name for general sale, and headed straight to Maeti to get it printed. So here we see on the title page, Presso Tommaso Bali Oni. This is the Polo printer's device of Minerva riding a lion, but the colophon, this is Maeti's device. Maeti means millet, and his printer's device has two chickens pecking up bits of millet off the ground. Galileo's Difesa colophon is the last explicit mark left by Maeti for nearly a decade, until his excommunication was revoked under intense political pressure in 1615. Maeti's name disappears completely from all publications in this period, but by using archival and material evidence, it's still possible to follow some of his activities. Already in 1606, he'd employed various pseudonyms and false imprints, and while this probably continued, he also chose to hide himself in full view by adopting his assistant Bali Oni's name. not a very good boss, I think, to work for. Many Bali Oni imprints are, in fact, merely reissues of earlier Maeti editions with new title pages. Back now to the Siderius Nuncius. One might suppose that the situation in 1610, with the interdict passed by 3 years, to be radically different to the political situation of 1607. But the polemics launched by the interdict, if anything, increased in Northern Europe during this period. Everything from the gunpowder plot of 1605 to the assassination of Henry IV of France in 1610 was swiftly ascribed to Jesuit machinations. Maeti was still extremely active in these debates, producing the most volatile text that he could find. And it's to the inquisitors that the book historian must turn to find what's missing from title pages. In 1610, the first Italian translation of the notorious French text, Anticoton, supposedly printed in Lyon, accused the Jesuit father, Pierre Coton, of justifying Henry IV's assassination as tyrannicide. The papal nuncio in Venice first noticed this book, quote, for sale secretly by the bookseller Maeti to his confidants. With the mark of this printer in Lyon, there's no such printer. Even though, and this is gives us an insight into how inquisitors read this kind of material, even though I doubt this because of the paper and Maeti's bad character. They're printed here, but it's hard to prove. Inquisitors are amazing material historians. They know that French paper feels different to Italian paper, and they're aware of the false tracks laid by printers. Such knowledge was not confined to Venice. The Venetian ambassador to Rome wrote to the Doge and Senate that Pope Paul V himself was aware of Maeti's concealed printing of the Anticoton, reporting, quote, in many copies there is the imprint of Lyon, but in fact it's printed in Venice, for both type and paper are recognized. The case of the Anticotone shows us that Maeti was still active as a printer in 1610 and took good care to cover his tracks when dealing with dangerous material. There were even rumors that he went so far in his typographical subterfuges as to import French type and paper to Venice to efface his presence. I don't know what we do as bibliographers when we come up against that kind of evidence. A second case leads us directly to those responsible for making the Siderius Nuncius. The headpiece of the Sidereus also appears in another publication from 1609, the 200 Novelle del Signor Celio Malaspina. This relatively rare work, containing titillating gossip and mild erotica, not worth reading for the erotica, gained notoriety for its banning in 1611. The author was a convicted forger of financial documents. He was supposed to have had his hand cut off, but he got away, as well as a literary plagiarizer. Most of these are lifted from French novels from the mid-16th century. He also managed to purloin one of Tasso's manuscripts and print Tasso against Tasso's will. And Tasso had to then rewrite and do a better edition than the first edition. Published, as you can see, Al Segno dell'Italia, at the sign of Italy, the book contains not only the same printer's woodcut as the Siderius, but also the work's woodcut headpiece, showing that it too came from the Polo brothers' presses. In a letter from March 1610, just as the Siderius Nuncius was being printed, the Venetian inquisitor claimed, quote, the book of the novella is printed by Maeti with a false license and name of printer. So the inquisitors knew full well that the books with this woodcut on the front were being printed illegally by Maeti. Anti-Jesuitica and erotica. Apologies, Father, for saying that phrase. These are the books alongside which the Siderius Nuncius was produced and which it materially resembles. This context, and I think only this context, helps us understand some contemporary reactions to the book. We must remember that the mild pro-Copernican statements in the Siderius Nuncius were not yet that theologically problematic. That only comes later. Hardline biblical anti-Copernicanism against Galileo's telescopic observations would really only become popular a few years later when Galileo tried to undermine the theologian's right to interpret Scripture, as we heard earlier today. Therefore, historians' attempts to explain early politico-theological reactions to the book have always made a weak case that Galileo's trial was already looming in 1610. Yet if we admit that inquisitors and others knew how to read the material clues of these books, these reactions start to make sense. Here, for example, is a telescopic warning from an ally of Galileo's writing from Prague in August 1610. He writes to Galileo and says, "The Spanish think that for reason of state, it's necessary for your book to be suppressed as pernicious to religion. And they do this with the cloak they permit themselves every evil in order to gain total control." Bit of a conspiracy theorist, but there's clearly murmurings against this book. The Siderius Nuncius was produced by an excommunicated printer of polemical political tracts, and contemporary readers were aware of that. I'll end now with an image from my next book, Forging the Moon. As I'm sure you know by now, it's a title page of the Siderius Nuncius, but this is a special copy. A few years ago, this copy was valued at $10 million until I came along. Now it's worthless. It has, or seems to have, Galileo Galilei's signature on it, and when you open it up, instead of having printed etchings of the moon, it has hand-done drawings of the moon, which the German art historian Horst Bredekamp spent 2 volumes authenticating, saying they were genuinely by Galileo. In fact, from the watermarked paper upwards, it's a complete fake, made in the year 2005, not 1610, by an Italian book thief and book dealer called Massimo De Caro, who you may have heard of. De Caro was clearly only in it for the money and is now under house arrest. But as I hope to have shown you today, in choosing the Siderius Nuncius as one of his forgeries, he may have hit upon precisely the right kind of target. Thank you very much.